name's Ariel. I just finished my master's at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel. I'm an economist and statistician by training. And more than a year ago now, I started looking at this topic of COVID and excess mortality when we were all, struck by COVID. And since then, I've become a member of the WHO's expert committee on COVID-19 mortality assessment. I came into contact with you because I saw your great conversation with Tim Nguyen. And I also had some experience with, let's call them the Weinstein brothers. Regarding excess mortality, we're going to talk about it later, but the experience with Bret Weinstein was really disheartening on my end and caused me to lose a lot of respect for him, which I once had due to the entire, Evergreen College and the entire issue there, which I still think it's a very interesting thing what happened and very sad thing what happened to Bret there. But I stopped following him because of all this.
I've stopped following Bret too because I no longer trust him. Well, I shouldn't speak too soon. I mean, I might tune back in at a certain point because one thing Eric Weinstein said that I very much agree with is that with individuals, you have to dine a la carte. They might have some really good ideas and some ideas you really don't like. They might generally not practice the epistemic virtues, but that doesn't mean they might not provide great insight at times. And I think Bret and Eric are both examples of people who, even though I think they often do not practice the epistemic virtues, at least when they're facing criticism, and who do have certain habits of mind that I think lead them astray often. Still, they're brilliant. They're galaxy brained, as David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom puts it. And they have a lot of good ideas, I think some of which are very valuable. So
Einstein was a socialist. I'm a classical liberal, so he was dead wrong on that, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't understand and rely on, relativity. I think he was even a communist, but, you can't blame a guy in the 30s.
Every cool person was. I'm kidding, but it was the cool thing to be. I mean, everyone who is now somewhat woke would have been communist then.
Yeah.
Right. Or communist sympathizing or communist adjacent. I don't know what the right
adjacent, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about this paper. By the way, what is the full title of it?
The full title is Tracking Excess Mortality Across Countries with the World Mortality Dataset. And in short, I'd like to, instead of this entire, long title, let's just call it the World Mortality Dataset. That's the word.
Great. That's the shorthand. WMD.
Yeah, someone pointed it out to us after we named it like that. And it's sort of ironic, but it's very good. It's very on brand in a sense. It's easy to remember.
That's certainly true. Okay, so let's begin by just getting clear on what excess mortality is. So I think it's a pretty simple concept, although then when I wrote out the definition, it doesn't sound as simple. So I'll tell you the definition I wrote out, and this is in colloquial terms. So excess mortality is you look at a particular period of time, for example, March 2020 to the present, and you determine whether the death rate during that period is more or less than we would have expected given death rates and death rate trends in the preceding years. Before March 2020, say. And you could reach this estimate for a country or a region within a country or the entire globe if you wanted.
Exactly. All the figures that we have about the death toll of previous pandemics going back centuries and even, other disasters, other natural disasters or, like the Great Famine in China or Stalinization or the Holodomor in Ukraine, the starvation, they are based on excess mortality. Because, back then doctors wouldn't have known how to say, okay, this guy died from this or this guy died from that. And, someone might be starving. He's not dying from lack of food in his system. He's much more vulnerable to a variety of things. So the way to understand how many people died, for example, in the Great Famine in China would be to look at, how many people died before the Great Famine. Mm-hmm. How many people you would expect to die, again, in China or in these regions of China, and how many people actually died. And if it's above what you would expect, it's excess mortality. Usually the variation between years in the US, in Brazil, in Israel, whatever, between years, it's usually like a couple of fractions of percentage points, 1-2%. So when you see sometimes, a 20% increase in mortality, so this is excess mortality.
Okay, so that's what excess mortality is. We might ask, how much excess mortality has there been since the COVID pandemic began compared to the mortality rate we would expect based on trends during the 5 years before the pandemic? Now, it's key to note that the answer to this question does not give us the COVID death toll. The reason is that, at least in theory, excess mortality since the pandemic began could be affected by several factors. One factor could be people dying of COVID. A second factor could be the medical system being overburdened by this new virus, causing more people than usual to die of non-COVID related medical conditions. A third factor is more people than usual dying of natural causes. One hypothesis here is that pandemic lockdowns could actually lead to lower than expected mortality rates for diseases like the flu, because people are inside and not interacting with each other. A fourth factor could be more people than usual dying of unnatural causes, such as suicide, drug overdose, or traffic accidents. So one hypothesis here is that things like losing your job, being forced to stay at home, having to social distance have caused many people to turn to drugs or suicide. Another hypothesis is that during the pandemic, there have been fewer traffic fatalities because there's been less driving. And finally, a fifth factor that could affect excess mortality figures since the pandemic began is more people than usual dying from extreme causes, just by coincidence, extreme weather events or wars coinciding with the pandemic. You have to prize apart which of these factors, people dying of COVID, overburdened medical system, people dying of natural causes, people dying of unnatural causes, people dying from extreme events. You have to prize apart which of those causes or which combination of those causes is driving the excess mortality. All that said, most commentators believe that the best way to estimate the COVID death toll is to estimate excess mortality and then narrow down which of the above factors, the 5 factors, seems most likely to account for most of the excess deaths or all of them. The alternative is to rely on official statistics, which greatly vary in quality from country to country and region to region within countries like India, depending on testing availability, in theory, government and health authorities lying, or government and health authorities simply being incompetent. One other great thing about excess mortality is that you don't have to debate whether medical authorities are accurately classifying people as having died due to COVID. Excess mortality tells us how many more people died than we would have expected, and that includes the large subset of people with comorbidities, many of whom contracted COVID and died, leading some to debate whether to classify their deaths as COVID deaths. Excess mortality just eliminates that whole set of complications, which a lot of people have spilt a lot of ink on, right?
Exactly. Even unfortunately, very, very prominent researchers such as Ioannidis have planted in their way too many articles. Okay, COVID death rate is, et cetera, et cetera. And then in parentheses, something like, but this is disregarding the entire discussion about whether it's with COVID or from COVID and all of these things, which again, if you think about it, how many people died of AIDS? Practically no one. What AIDS does, it weakens your immune system substantially, such that, even a mild cold or something that you and I will catch as a mild cold is very, very harmful. Or the same, if you go through cancer therapy, it weakens your immune system tremendously. So you have to be even more careful than usual. But we would still say, okay, this guy didn't die of the cold. He died of HIV. So there's no doubt in my mind that COVID interacts with, old age and a variety of other health reasons. But this variety of other health properties existed in 2019 as well, and in 2018 and 2017 and 2015, et cetera.
When you're asking whether COVID or AIDS or anything caused someone to die, the question is whether they would have died if they did not have COVID or AIDS. And again, excess mortality is just a very elegant way of estimating precisely that. It's the whole population, which includes the subset of people who are vulnerable to something like that. And the mortality rates in the years before COVID or AIDS tells us what percentage of those people usually die. And right. So it's one thing I really like about the excess mortality measure.
I first came upon it due to publications in The Economist and the Financial Times, which were really great in that regard. But they mostly, had data from rich first world advanced countries. When they said it, I thought, yes, they're exactly correct. It's exactly, again, like this catch-all measure that should incorporate all of these things, and then you need to work hard at parsing them out. But that's what you should be focusing on, and not just on, okay, this is the number of COVID deaths, because you might be missing on important things, which excess mortality is a better measure. So I was what you would call a COVID skeptic at first. I did think that lockdowns and other NPIs are, a cure worsens disease. So COVID is like a flu, and what's going to happen is you're going to drive up unemployment, you're going to drive up mental issues. People are going to die or suffer heavily from all of these governmental interventions. And if your objective function is to minimize COVID deaths, you might get that by NPIs. It could be lockdowns, and it could be just like restrictions on social gatherings, closing schools. Could be, there's a whole spectrum of things between lockdown and doing nothing. I thought that would be worse than COVID. Imagine that you're Stalin, right? Like we often do. You want to minimize COVID deaths. The best Stalin way to do it is to shoot everybody, right? So if you shoot everybody and say you still record deaths, objectively, COVID deaths would be zero because all of these people died from a gunshot to the head. But excess deaths would spike. They would spike tremendously. So excess mortality is this catch-all measure. It does combine all of these effects that you listed, and that's what we should be investigating. And there was no good data to do it until we came along.
One thing that I want to introduce here, although I only want to talk about it later, is that we might disagree that minimizing excess death is the best way to approach responding to COVID. Because obviously people can suffer a lot and there can be a lot of missed opportunities that would not be reflected in death statistics. But we can come back to that. Okay, so if we're trying to estimate the COVID death toll, the best way to do it methodologically is to estimate excess mortality and then use additional reasoning and methods to determine which of the possible factors or which combination of the possible factors is driving the excess death, if in fact there is any. Okay, so that's your view. And that is why you created this huge all-cause mortality data set. A data set, in other words, that gathers for as many countries as possible the best data on how many people have died every week, month, or quarter going back to 2015. So any researcher with this data set will be able to see how many people were dying weekly, monthly, or quarterly in the years leading up to the pandemic, and how many people have been dying weekly, monthly, and quarterly since the pandemic started.
Exactly. So the world mortality data set is simply the count of deaths in, I think we're now at 112 countries and territories across the world. So it's by month or week. In Tajikistan, it's quarterly, but they should release the monthly data sometime soon.
Okay, so it's the largest data set currently available. The article says 103 countries, but you just said 111 or 112. So the countries that are included in the data set are basically North America, Europe, Japan, all developed countries, but then also the former Soviet Union. And when I say the former Soviet Union, I mean really the former Soviet Union, like Tajikistan, so I'm not just talking about like Russia and some Eastern European countries. I'm talking about the stands, right? Which are pretty undeveloped countries, right? And then also virtually all of Latin America. So the countries that are included are an interesting mix of developed and less developed countries. Now, all of the countries that are missing are less developed or developing, right? So sub-Saharan Africa, most of the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, most notably India, China, Southeast Asia. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you generated the data set and minimized inaccuracies? And also maybe you could comment on why some countries were included and others weren't.
Okay. So first of all, have you ever tried, getting some data from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or something like that?
In America, yes.
The website? Yeah, in America.
It's amazing.
It's amazing, but was it easy to do to find the exact data that you're after?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Okay. So imagine doing it for Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Israel and France and Canada and Colombia. So I essentially went to all the websites of these national statistics offices and I looked for this information, which is colloquially usually called vital statistics, which is deaths, births, marriages, and divorces, usually. And if I didn't find it, I tried contacting them. There was an email address, there was a contact me form, whatever. And some replied, some haven't. So no country is excluded, but some countries did not provide data either by saying we don't have it, we might have it in the future, or saying we don't have it entirely or not responding at all.
Now I understand why all the countries of the former Soviet Union were included in the data set, because it's probably a legacy of the Soviet bureaucracy. But go on.
I also think so, because again, when you think about it, why would countries even want to collect and publish to varying extent this data, it's because, they need to plan ahead to, build schools and roads and stuff like that. And if there's one thing that the Soviet countries thought they needed to do is to collect data. They need to understand how many people are living where, how they're transitioning from place to place. So also in that sense, even though we don't have data from China, the National Statistics Office told me that there is none. I don't think that's true. I do think there are a lot of things that the Chinese regime doesn't know, but pretends to know. But I think that we have good estimates that at least like 75% of deaths are registered in China, and they are trying to register deaths. So they do have this, because otherwise you can't really, have a centralized planning economy. So yes, Tajikistan and Russia and Serbia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and all of these countries, they have very good population registers, because counting the number of people you have is like the most basic function of trying to have a planned economy.
I mean, it's almost an indicator of state effectiveness. That's why it's interesting that almost every country in Latin America has data that was included. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted ex ante that virtually all Latin American countries would have this data, and virtually all countries in the Middle East and North Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa would not have this data.
I think in Latin America, we did get a bit lucky. Peru is probably the best example of this. There was a large reform of the entire vital registration system, moving it online. In Peru, I think it started in 2015 or 2016. So had COVID happened 10 years ago, I think the map of data availability would have been pretty similar to what it is today, and we would have had much less countries from Latin America. Also, what's interesting is that colonialism is good, for me at least, for this data, because there are these overseas departments. So there are basically counties of France, and they belong to France, but they're in the Caribbean, and they're in Africa, and they're in the Pacific. And because they have French vital registration systems, I'm able to have some glimpse into vital registration in areas which are usually pretty poor and undeveloped. So I might not know what's happening in Haiti or in Fiji, but I do know what's happening in Martinique and Réunion and New Caledonia and French Polynesia.
So what you're saying is you wish the whole world were still colonized.
Yes, of course. I think the whole world should be colonized by Peru, because Peru's data, it's simply like an Excel spreadsheet that gets updated daily. And it's amazingly fast and current compared even to, the UK and the US and Spain, where it's usually every few months, there's an update of data. Just 6 months ago, Germany finally released 2015 weekly data. We only had it from 2016. So Germany, the country where you think people are, the most organized and orderly, actually a large part of their vital registration and medical system is still done by pen and paper. So if you want a title for the video, it should be Peru should conquer the world, and then data would be proven. But again, that's because they are right now undergoing a reform to vitally improve their vital registration system, which again, in this regard, is very, very helpful.
Okay, so kind of zooming out a little bit, if experts can agree, reasonable people can agree that the best way to estimate the COVID death toll is to estimate excess mortality and then do more specific analysis to make sure that you know what factor is causing the excess mortality. If we can agree that that's the best way to estimate the COVID death toll, then maybe the most important thing you've done is to create this data set to allow people to do that, to allow people, including yourself, to do that, to estimate excess mortality and use it to estimate the COVID death toll. So that's a big part of what you've done. Took a lot of work to generate this data. It's the largest data set of its kind. It's updated almost daily, and it includes a lot of developing countries, not just developed countries. Okay, so let's shift from a conversation about the data set and what was required to generate it to a discussion of your excess mortality estimates and the various findings you reached and your interpretation of those findings.
Okay. So first of all, we found that in especially the developed countries, OECD countries, Western European countries, and North American countries, excess mortality and COVID deaths are pretty much completely aligned, move completely in tandem, sort of like a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you heard on the news that 1,000 people died of COVID today, this week, whatever, it's excess mortality is about 1,000 as well. For me, this was the first interesting finding because in Israel, and again, also in the US and many other countries, there was all this talk that hospitals or doctors have incentives to certify deaths as COVID deaths because they might get more money out of it. So, someone died, again, doesn't really matter what. People even told me someone died in a traffic accident, the hospital will say died of COVID, and then they're going to get more money. This was a major talking point of COVID skeptics, especially here in Israel, but everyone is the same in this regard. I see Russian misinformation and Israeli misinformation and American misinformation. It's all very much alike in a sense. They said something along the lines of, listen, every year influenza kills a couple of, thousands of people. But we don't care. We simply don't care. But now there's a spotlight on it and we call it COVID. But if you would have looked at excess mortality, you would have seen there's this famous, he used to be a high official in the Ministry of Health here called Yoram Las. And he said it's changing the stickers. So imagine, bodies in the mortuary and they have this little sticker on, cause of death. And it used to say flu and now it says COVID. But if you would look at it, you would see that, it's like almost the same amount of people. So this is not true. Pretty much every COVID death is an excess, is death above and beyond what you would expect in ordinary times. It's not this change of stickers that we talked about, but essentially a 1-to-1 ratio.
I thought it might be interesting just for people to know how countries compared to each other and to be able to compare one country's excess mortality to what is normal, like average, or what is right in the middle or median.
Okay, so the best summary metric of that is in our figure 4. We derive 4 primary metrics for each country. So the first one is the total number of excess deaths, absolute counts. The second one is excess deaths per capita. So it takes into account the size of the population. So for example, the US and Russia have pretty similar total excess deaths, almost 1 million in both. But, the US is about 2.5 to 3 times bigger population size than Russia. So on a per capita term, Russia has done much worse. The other metric that we have is what is called the P-score, which is sometimes people confuse it with a Z-score or a p-value. It's neither.
P-value.
Yeah, I think it was first suggested by the researchers at Our World in Data, and they deserve a lot of credit for it. It's a very simple measure. What it does is it looks at the expected number of deaths. So, for example, 1,000, and say we found 1,500 deaths. So the P-score would just be 1,500 divided by 1,000, and in this case, 50%, 1.5. And that gives you the increase from expected. And the reason that it's such a good metric, or what does it give you that per capita excess deaths don't give you, is that there are countries where the population sizes are very similar. So for example, Israel has a very similar population size to many, small northern Western European countries, Belgium, Denmark, etc. But Israel is much, much, much younger. There are many more elderly people in Denmark. So if you have 1,000 excess deaths in Israel and Denmark, on a per capita term, it's very similar. Mm-hmm. But if you would estimate how big 1,000 is compared to what you expected, in Israel, it will be twice as bad. So when you compare, for example, these two metrics, the per capita versus the P-score, what you find is that on a per capita basis, the countries that have done the worst, at least in our data, are mostly very old countries. Like former Soviet countries really dominate this table. It would be Russia and Serbia and the various stands. When you go to the P-scores, what happens there is the countries that dominate are actually Latin American countries. A lot of people have also discussed this. You would have expected them to do better, sort of, because they are so young. And then what happens is if you have a large excess mortality, given, pretty low expected mortality because the population is so young, you get pretty large P-scores.
Just take 2 hypothetical countries, country X and country Y. If country X has a significantly older population than country Y, you would expect the infection fatality rate to be higher in country X than in country Y. You want to control for that. That's what the P-score does. It really accounts for anything that might make a population more vulnerable to COVID. So even higher obesity rates, right?
In a sense, it's pretty similar to taking excess mortality and normalizing it according to maybe similar to what you said, sort of like population at risk. So take, elderly people with comorbidities. It's a really great summary metric because, yes, it encompasses both population size and let's call it vulnerability, which in this case is mostly age, but not just age. So, even a young country like Mexico has millions of elderly people, even though it's just like 5% versus 20% in Western Europe. So you could potentially have hundreds of thousands of deaths in Mexico if the COVID was more spread, say, around the elderly population or something along those lines.
One colloquial way of saying what the P score captures would be to say that having a really high P score means that if you're vulnerable to COVID, you're more screwed than places with a low P score, right? Because like fewer people died in Mexico, but if you were vulnerable to COVID, if you were obese, if you were old, it's probably the worst place in the world to be. I don't mean Mexico specifically, but Latin America, right? Latin America was worse than Eastern Europe to be, or worse than former Soviet Union countries to be, if you are vulnerable to COVID.
Could be, and the reasons for this are multifaceted. So, for example, I do think that in Latin America, there are more multi-generational homes, maybe sort of like what you see in Italy than in East and Western Europe. So it could be that even if the elderly people, they stay in the house, if the young population is going outside, getting infected and returning home, it's a much different scenario than, elderly care homes where you supposedly could protect them just by limiting access to the elderly care home and the workers there, and not, the children of the children of the children who go around in these multi-generational dwellings.
That's a really interesting hypothesis. I mean, that's sort of the stereotype about Latin America. And I've lived for a few years in Latin America, and my anecdotal observations confirm it. Yes, there were many multi-generational homes spanning the economic classes.
In Israel, there's a large ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community, Hasidic. And the largest Haredi town is called Bnei Brak. And when you look at the age pyramid of Bnei Brak, it's extremely young. So a huge percentage of the population is, aged below like 14, 12, maybe even 10 years old. But when some people at the Ministry of Health published a paper on excess mortality by town, Bnei Brak was pretty high because there are also multi-generational homes. So there are a lot of babies. So the median age in each household might be very low, but you also live with your grandparents.
The ultra-religious shall inherit the earth. In the United States, I think if current trends continue, the Amish will be the largest demographic in like 100 years. My fiance and I went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania a few months ago and spent an hour or two at an operating farm run by an Amish family. And it was an incredible experience. It was only an hour or two from where I lived, but you cannot travel farther. They're living in a completely different, really, world in almost every sense.
So if you don't know it, I encourage you to listen to Amish Paradise by Weird Al.
I know it. Oh yeah. Milking lots of cows, turning lots of butter, raised a barn on Tuesday, then I raised another. Yeah. You've seen the video, right?
Of course.
You remember when the two kids are looking at like the Amish Playboy, and it's an Amish woman who pulls up her dress to expose ankle skin? Now I want to come to a very important substantive question that is relevant to a lot of the political divide over Western society's response to COVID. So what can you say generally about the causes of excess mortality globally since the pandemic began? As we talked about earlier, in theory, it could be due to people dying of COVID. It could be due to an overburdened medical system causing people to die of non-COVID related conditions. It could be due to an uptick in death by unnatural causes such as suicides, overdoses. There are all of these potential drivers of excess mortality. And on different sides of the political spectrum, people have emphasized certain factors or maybe wanted certain factors to be more prominent. So what did you learn?
We found that 98% of excess mortality, 99 could be even, is direct COVID-19 deaths. There is not a single country in our data set that doesn't have COVID, like Australia and New Zealand, which are the most prominent examples, that has excess mortality. None. Simply none. There's no such thing. Because if you don't have COVID and you don't have influenza, there was basically no influenza-like illness or ILI in 2020 and the start of 2021. And and in most countries, homicides went down, traffic accident deaths went down, a lot of these unnatural causes of death went down. So you would expect 1,000 deaths, but you actually got 900 deaths. And that was the situation in Australia and New Zealand that everybody knows about, but also countries, at least until the end of 2020, very little people, heard about, such as Uruguay in South America and Mongolia in, East Asia and many other small island countries. It was true in Taiwan. It was true in Japan, Norway. So I think even all of the Scandinavian countries, except for Sweden and Finland, had zero excess mortality or even what we call deficit mortality. And even if you look at, for example, like sub-national data, like regions of the UK or, states in the US, you see that, for example, there was the large first lockdown in the US in like March, April 2020. Excess mortality and COVID mortality were only like mostly on the East Coast, but also a bit in Washington state, right? And there was no excess mortality, no COVID mortality, in the Midwest or California. None whatsoever. If excess mortality was the result of, people committing suicides on droves or something like that due to lockdowns, this should happen even in places without COVID, right? It did not happen. The other way around, there are these countries like Serbia and Belarus and these countries where excess mortality is very high. They had no lockdowns and they had a spread of COVID. So it's probably driven by the spread of COVID. So it's like two distinct strands of evidence that in each one I can isolate it better than I can do in the US or in the UK or Western Europe or Israel, where, you had the mixture of both lockdowns and COVID, and then it's hard to parse out. Russia is a good example in this regard as well, because up to the end of November, our excess mortality estimates, they are at 980,000. So essentially 1 million excess deaths in Russia alone. But Russia, except for a very brief period, I think in April and May 2020, had almost no restrictions on, economic activity, movement, civil liberties. There are restrictions on civil liberties in Russia all the time, but not more so than usual. So it also serves as a good example of you can isolate the variable of, NPIs, because there was virtually no NPIs there, but there was large COVID spread. No. And we also, for countries that are better at tracking these sorts of things, because just like, certifying a death as a COVID death is pretty nuanced. Certifying a death as a suicide is also pretty nuanced. But for places where we do have good statistics on suicides, which is mostly the developed world, but also countries in Eastern Europe and Latin America and such, not only do we not see an increase in suicides in 2020, because this is the latest data that exists, but in some countries, we even see some sort of decrease. Another, unnatural cause of death that was talked about a lot is homicides. So Americans, and I'm like half American, so I notice Americans have this tendency to look at America as the entire world. And they know that in America, homicides have spiked. And that's true. But it is untrue to the rest of the world. In very violent countries like Peru and Mexico and Colombia, violent deaths went down substantially. And in Western European countries, they say that about the same, like 5 to 10% increase, decrease.
Yeah, and people are very interested in understanding why there's been a 30% spike in homicide in the United States, and some have attributed it to COVID. But as you say, if you look at the US in the context of the world, COVID and lockdowns, et cetera, have not generally contributed to homicide. In fact, in many countries, homicide has gone down.
It could be, some much more nuanced argument where you have an sort of like an interaction effect between, the anti-police protesting with a large amounts of weapons that leads to, like turf wars and stuff like that. And
also people exiting the jail system at higher numbers than usual, police pulling back due to the protest. Yeah, I think all of those things are potential alternative explanations. One argument that the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration and other critics of more draconian responses to the COVID pandemic make, and this may be in reaction to the discovery that excess mortality is fully accounted for by COVID deaths, is that we're not seeing excess mortality in excess of COVID deaths now, but we might see excess mortality caused by the lockdown in the future. So future excess mortality, as distinct from very recent measurable excess mortality, may be going up as a result of lockdown and other pandemic-related restrictions. Do you have any response to that?
Future excess mortality, it's a very interesting topic. I don't think it's going to be the case. What they're saying basically is something along those lines. Okay, so people might not be committing suicides en masse because they're lonely under lockdown, but the mental issues that develop right now, maybe, for example, among children who are isolated from their peers, might develop in decades to come. And then you will see, I don't know, a lot of depressed adults who will have, worse life results and, access mortality, or people who have cancer or might have cancer and they're missing their doctor's appointments because prevention is the best cure. And if you're unable to prevent it, you might get worse in the future. I think my point on this is that the future access mortality is much more theoretical than they say. There's sort of like a joke in empirical economics nowadays that, theoretically, the direction of the effect is ambiguous. So it needs to be determined empirically. And that has been so amazingly true in this pandemic. I also thought theoretically lockdowns should increase deaths due to poverty, suicide, and it didn't. It simply did not. Might it be postponed into the future? I don't think so, because I do think that from what I know about, the psychological literature, a lot of suicides are either, people who have been struggling with mental issues for a large period of their life, or due to, extreme events having an outsized influence now. So I don't think people are going to commit suicide because 20 years ago they were under lockdown. Again, is it fun to be under lockdown? No, it is certainly not. But it's also not fun to have your grandmother die due to COVID. So,
I mean, just so stories are a dime a dozen. This is why it is so much more compelling when someone predicts something than when someone explains something that has already happened. You can always find an explanation for something that has already happened, but to predict something is impressive prima facie. Now, very often when you find people who have predicted something, it turns out they've been predicting that thing for like their entire life, right?
Yeah, we have a joke in, economics or libertarian economics. Peter Schiff predicted 50 of the last 20 economic crises. So,
right.
And then it makes his prediction less compelling.
Yeah, a broken clock is right twice a day. There's a guy, James Howard Kunstler, I think, who wrote a book called The Long Emergency. And it was about peak oil and our running out of cheap oil and that leading to global civilizational setback. And it rose up the bestseller charts in the mid-aughts when oil prices peaked. And I read it on my mom's recommendation and really enjoyed it. I was much more ignorant then, but still really enjoyed it. And then did a little bit of research on him. And this guy has just been like, he was like a Y2K alarmist. And yeah, so he's another good example of this. But the scientific method, strangely, is underrated. Our ability to theorize why things have happened and what things will happen is extremely limited. And my basic definition of an ideologue is someone who, when their notions collide with the evidence, they side with their notions rather than with the evidence. And I do think that, one respect in which I'm very much a conservative is epistemic humility, like our ability to understand the reality that we inhabit, why the institutions that we operate under work to the extent that they do is just very limited. And our ability to predict the effects of policy interventions is very limited. And it's funny, like some people say like government should have departments of unintended consequences. And I agree, although it would be a government body, which means it would really suck at even looking at that. Probably. But what you said about, I can't remember how you put it, but basically like the theoretical prediction is ambiguous. So you have to look at the evidence. It kind of put me in mind of those more general ideas. One other thing I was going to say is that, it's very hard to move the needle when you're looking at a complex global outcome like excess mortality. I would be very surprised if we saw a significant increase in future excess mortality. The mental health arguments make almost no sense to me personally, because if people aren't dying due to mental health now, the idea that they would be dying due to mental health legacies or longer term or medium term mental health effects of the pandemic seems pretty far-fetched to me. Now, in theory, it makes sense that people might be delaying cancer screenings and therefore dying in cancer in statistically greater numbers in like 10 or 20 years or something like that.
There is pretty significant evidence that during large peaks of COVID, there are a lot of decreases in preventive care. That's true.
Off the top of your head, do you remember how many of the 103 or 111 countries underreported?
No, but if you'll give me a second and then I'll appear super smart, I can tell you. Out of 112 countries in our data set, 58 countries have some degree of undercounting, which means that their excess mortality is higher than reported COVID-19 mortality. It could be as low as like a 1 to 2 or 4% difference, like in Liechtenstein in Europe. It could be, 30, 50, 100 times higher, or 2.5 times higher, like it is in many Latin American countries. But like about half or even more than half of the countries are probably undercounting their COVID-19 toll by some degree.
So roughly half of the countries that you measured underreported, although if we included Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, then the large bulk or the vast majority of countries would have underreported. That is, in reality, probably 2/3 or more have underreported. But within your data set, about half. Now, of the countries that underreported, some countries sincerely tried to report accurately but lacked capacity. Other countries completely fabricated their COVID death tolls, like Nicaragua. And then some had elements of sincere attempts to report accurately with data manipulation, like Russia, where you said that there is a strong correlation between the official COVID death toll and your excess mortality estimates, but they also capped the COVID death toll at 1,000 per day. So maybe could you just say a little bit more about that whole set of issues and maybe give us a sense of like how many countries of the ones that underreported fell into each of those bins?
Okay. So it's a very interesting question. We don't go into detail about it in this current paper, but there is work that I'm currently doing with my former supervisor using this difference or this ratio between excess deaths and reported COVID deaths as some, measure of corruption or obfuscation or, lack of transparency as such. And then you need to ask yourself, wait, are you going to say that every difference between access and reported is, this country is lying? I don't think that's the case in some parts of Latin America. And I can see that by the fact that governments there are the ones that publish this data and put a spotlight to it. And it was not just hidden in plain sight. And there is not just correlation, but really tracking between excess mortality and COVID mortality in a way that to me seems sincere, but just, this gap is more of a capacity gap. Bolivia and Mexico are a good example. In Mexico, for example, the Mexican Ministry of Health, back in the day, I haven't been tracking it entirely because it's in Spanish and I don't understand Spanish, but every few weeks, there would be a press release statement and a video that the Minister of Health or some high official there would show, okay, this is the reported COVID deaths. And also, this is our excess mortality. And look how much it tracks. And we are publishing these figures because we know that we have limited testing capacity, especially in the more, distant rural areas of Mexico. So in a sense, it's almost similar to what Peru did, albeit on a smaller scale. But there are countries which are hiding immense death tolls, and these are mostly former Soviet countries, but also not just places like Nicaragua, which a very simple examination of reported figures would have told you that something is extremely fishy there because Nicaragua has been reporting one death a week for the past year and a half, which makes zero sense regardless of whatever it is. It's complete nonsense. And excess mortality shows you what is happening there, which is very substantial. Tajikistan, up to the end of 2020, they reported slightly less than 100 COVID deaths, which never made any sense to anyone. Yeah, it's not like a small island country with 1,000 inhabitants. It's I think like 4 million, 3 million people, something like that. But excess mortality is actually slightly more than 9,000 people. So it's 100 times ratio, which is the largest ratio that we find. So in Bolivia, in Mexico, it's like 2 to 3 times higher. Excess is higher than reported COVID. But there are countries where it's 5 times, 10 times, 20, 30, 100 times higher. So Russia, in this sense, is an interesting case. So if I would have told you, beforehand, before seeing all the results, that I compared Russia to all the developed countries, and I found that in most developed countries, the undercount ratio is about 1 or 1.1, 1.2, and in Russia it's 4, right? So this alone probably tells you that there's something else going on, which is not capacity, because we also know that the vital registration capacity of Russia is considered very good. Their statistical capacity is very good. It's miles beyond that in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia. There's just no doubt about it. Again, if there is one thing that communists know how to do very well, is to count. Robert Conquest, the famous historian who dealt a lot with Soviet Russia, there was a large debate, in economics and history about the economic output of Soviet countries. And there was some economists that said that the USSR is going to overtake the US as the largest economy, etc. And people always said, okay, the GDP, imports, exports, all these data coming from the USSR, it's not completely reliable. So we're gonna, downward correct it by a factor of, 20%, 30%, whatever. The assumption there is something like if Russia tells you 100, it was 80, and they increased it somewhat to make themselves look better. So an historian friend of mine told me that Conquest had a completely different view of this. He said, no, everything published is complete junk because the entire chain of command from the lowest station to the highest station has an incentive to lie and inflate. So the numbers are meaningless. It's not you apply some correction factor and you get the truth. The numbers are meaningless. And then he used observable, objective information such as, the number of ships that go into the port, which is something that is very hard to hide. So if you look at the reported COVID statistics in Russia, they make very little epidemiological sense. Up until a month ago, they were capped at like 1,000. So it was like 999 people died today, 998, 999. It was, way too pretty. Follows no statistical justification. Well, and there, I think the issue is more, authoritarianism rather than the capacity, because we know that the Russian vital registration system is very good. So if there was no Nicaragua and Tajikistan and all these countries where it's a factor of 30, 50, 100, I think a factor of 4, which is, 398% higher, is absolutely mind-boggling. But considering you have these even more ghastly undercounts, then Russia looks sort of pretty good. But it is true that I think Russia has, the highest undercount, or one of the highest undercounts, considering its capacity. So I think that this undercount ratio is very telling of not just the true toll of COVID-19, but also the true character of the regime. You can see just by looking at the rankings, you see that the top 10 countries by undercount ratio are countries where you know that they are authoritarian, at least. Nicaragua, I think, is an interesting example here because Nicaragua, up until sort of recently, even the Polity Dataset, which is a very known data set for measuring democracy versus autocracy, lists Nicaragua as a democracy because they have, they have elections and stuff like that. But probably since like 2016 or something like that, Daniel Ortega there has really centralized control. And now a lot of what used to be national state-run enterprises are now run by his party, which I forgot its name right now.
The Sandinistas, FSON.
Yes, the Sandinistas. So, for example, Polity still describes Nicaragua 2020 as a democracy. They do have a flag there that says, we are not really sure that this ranking still makes sense. We are, investigating it.
That's ridiculous. Like, first of all, almost every country in the world holds some kind of elections. I mean, it's pretty well known in political science that elections are grossly insufficient for democracy. I mean, it's not just that Nicaragua isn't a democracy. It's not even a semi-democracy. It's not even a hybrid regime. It's a full-on dictatorship at this point. It's ironic because the Sandinistas came into power overthrowing a personalistic dictator, the Somoza dynasty, but that's what Ortega has become. But anyway, I mean, like, Nicolas Maduro won an election, right? The question is whether the elections are free and fair. I think Freedom House would measure level of democracy much more accurately. I'm not a big fan of Freedom House, but I do think that they would be onto the fact that Nicaragua is unquestionably an authoritarian system. Sorry.
So most other measures, if I recall correctly, do classify Nicaragua as on the authoritarian side or lack of constraints on the executive. But in Polity, it was like really funny. It placed it similar to like Brazil in the sense that, the prime minister is constrained. Brazil is also an interesting case in this regard because I think there's very good evidence that Bolsonaro wanted to obfuscate. He's been a denier and minimizer along the entire way. But, he doesn't get to do what he wants. He's not Putin. Right? The Brazilian institutions are fairly independent, even at the state level and various ministries. So the undercount ratio that we find for Brazil is even smaller than the US. It's like 10, 15% higher than reported, which is like Chile and other functioning democracies.
What you say is very true. It's very consonant with what I have taught my courses about Brazil versus other Latin American countries. Like Chile, it's one of relatively few countries in Latin America with very strong institutions of horizontal accountability. So an independent Congress, an independent judiciary, actually a pretty high level of federalization. So even the states represent a check on federal power. And for all of those reasons, just as in the United States, what the president wants doesn't necessarily happen. And that's a good thing. Also in Brazil, you just have a pretty active civil society and a strong media. So you have all of these forces that constrain power. And that's much less true in a country like, Nicaragua and Venezuela are extreme cases, but even in Peru, that's much less true. Mexico is another example where institutions of horizontal accountability are pretty strong. In Chile, obviously. Okay, so if you had to distill the main substantive finding, it's something like estimated excess mortality is the best measure of the COVID death toll globally?
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Excess mortality is a catch-all measure. It is a better measure of the true toll of COVID around the world because it is not subject to either direct manipulation or, capacity constraints and testing constraints of countries to certify COVID deaths, which also varies a lot by countries. In France, it's a more inclusive approach. In Russia, it's a more exclusive approach. But if you want to get a single number summary measure of the COVID-19 death toll, you should look at excess mortality.
So you wouldn't go so far as to say that in every country, estimated excess mortality is necessarily the best measure of the COVID death toll. For example, the best measure of the COVID death toll in France or Belgium might be the official COVID death toll.
Yes.
But globally, estimated excess mortality is the best measure of the actual COVID death toll.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so now I want to raise kind of just a philosophical question. So assuming your finding is true, that excess mortality is measuring deaths from COVID overwhelmingly, not deaths caused by an overburdened medical system or deaths by suicide or overdose caused by the lockdown. My main response would be that it still doesn't follow necessarily that the degree of lockdown and cessation of societal activity that we have lived through were the ideal response to the pandemic. In other words, minimizing death may not be the best objective during a pandemic. My suggestion, in short, is that minimizing death may be equivalent to maximizing existence, but it's not equivalent to maximizing life. Because of the way we've responded to COVID, people, young to old, have lived much more cramped, constrained lives in their families, socially, educationally, economically, professionally. And I'm still not sure we've balanced the interests of the old and otherwise physically vulnerable with the interests of the young, healthy, and mentally vulnerable appropriately. And I'm not just talking about the government response. I'm talking about the way people have responded. At least in the US, as a society, we may be too safety concerned, too existence concerned, too death afraid, insufficiently vital and bold. This may sound a little harsh, but too focused on safety and compassion for the weak, which are good in their measure, but insufficiently focused on life and action and strength, which are good in their measure too. So I put that out there just as an idea, a suggestion, and I'm curious what your response is. I know now you're going beyond your research. This is more of a philosophical, moral question.
The short answer is that I agree with what you said. The long answer is more complicated. What is the proper response? That's a very good debate to have, both philosophically and, policy-wise. I do think, and this is totally hindsight 2020, because I was a staunch supporter of removing restrictions and lockdowns in Israel in mid-2020. I saw excess mortality, but I thought we do need to consider the trade-offs and balance these things and, allow some activities to go as planned. But I think this is it could be the wrong approach. And it could be sort of what's bringing us to this current situation where it's still circulating and it seems like it's sort of like a never-ending, roller coaster ride, is exactly this trade-off like thinking of economists where you say, okay, I'm not going to put all my cards on this particular metric of zero COVID or something like that. I also want to allow some, social gatherings, allow life to go on, but that just makes it go on for longer. So I think it could be that the Australian or, Taiwanese or Singaporean approaches to this, or even the Chinese approach, which is to eliminate COVID from circulation, it might seem extreme, but it might, in hindsight, be even the best approach for economics. So
it might ironically be liberty maximizing.
Exactly. And even countries with less stringent national policies, but maybe very stringent border control measures like Taiwan and South Korea and Japan also had no excess mortality. So life in Japan and Taiwan and Singapore, up until latest data at least, were pretty much regular, except for maybe at the start of the pandemic. but they did enforce a pretty strict border control measure, which I really think is the most important and probably the least costly in terms of, human welfare. It does beg the question, okay, if COVID did enter and is circulating right now, what are you going to do? It's too late to say, okay, let's stop it at the gate. But I do think that strict border control was and probably even is still the best measure. I would say that this is not the opinion of, the WHO's expert committee that I'm a member of, and it's not the opinion of the Hebrew University. It's not the opinion of anything that I belong to. It's just my opinion from looking at this data closely. In Israel, the national security is a huge concern, and we have active enemy states surrounding us. So in Israel, security and military analogies always work very well. Consider a Syrian army crosses the border into Israel. Now, the response of Israel historically has been, and will probably be in the future, that this threat needs to be crushed as soon as possible. Most able-bodied men are also serving in the reserve army of Israel. So even though the standing army of Israel is not as big because, we are a small country, we're going to send pretty much everything we have against this threat. We're going to keep, some soldiers on other borders to prevent another attack. But we're going to crush it as soon as we can with all the force. And then we have, a 6-day war instead of, years of war, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, in this time where, most of the effort of the society is going to the war, it's liberty draining, right? People are not operating stores. They're not doing whatever they want. They're fighting wars. It's a terrible loss. But then it's liberty maximizing in the long sense. But we have fought COVID in the sense that, look, it's only 40 Syrian soldiers. So, let's send 40 soldiers against them. But then the 40 soldiers become 100 soldiers and turn into 200 and you get a tank in. So going at it while trying to balance this thing, thinking like an economist and rather than thinking like, a general, I hate to say it because I'm an economist and I like economists generally. And I think thinking on the trade-offs is very important. It might have been the wrong approach. I do think that some of the current libertarian critiques of the pandemic response are pretty laughable because the libertarian critique of agencies like the FDA that I know and relate to is that the FDA is too risk averse in approving drugs and treatments. So now the fact that many of these people are now claiming, look, it's just an emergency unauthorized authorization. It's complete nonsense. The classical libertarian approach has been let the FDA even approve drugs that might even kill a single person if they save 100 people. Currently, even before you test the effectiveness of a drug, the FDA says that even if one person dies, you don't do it. So toxicity is much more important than effectiveness. It's a very big issue. What would happen if I took a drug and I died? Will my family just say, okay, they saved 1,000 people? But this entire approach of now libertarians saying, no, the FDA did not properly authorize going through all the hoops that usually take years. This usually takes years things is killing people, right? Yeah. That's what's killing people. Reasonable people can disagree with the trade-off balancing and stuff. I have many economist friends who still say that there should have been some balancing. But I think the net result in countries that have reacted severely to COVID by not allowing it to spread, not 1 inch of the motherland, have also remained open for longer because they removed the threat from circulating. And when COVID is not circulating, things can go back to normal. There's really no issue.
It's obviously very important to distinguish between the political response and the response of individuals in a given context. I think you're suggesting that a proper political response might be to curtail liberties significantly for a short period of time in order to expedite the return to normalcy and thereby maximize liberty in the long term. And that's a very coherent, understandable position, one that I might even agree with. I haven't thought about it that much. But what motivated my comment is just seeing, political reality in the United States is that the government is not going to do anything like that. And then the question becomes, what's the most sensible way to act given that political reality in the United States? How should people behave? How fearful of COVID should they be in their daily lives? To what extent should they restrict themselves familially, socially, etc.? And there's just a level of timidity and fear and obsession with safety that I see in a lot of people around me, even family members, that is just very very deadening and uninspiring. That's largely what's motivating me. I wish people would just risk death a little more. Or that more old and otherwise vulnerable people would say, my health is my responsibility. I don't want you guys to stop living for a really long time in order to minimize the likelihood of my dying due to COVID. I mean, I think a noble position would be to say, yeah, I don't want to die, but I also don't want all of you not to live. I just don't hear much of that sort of argument coming from older Americans, for example, or even Americans with comorbidities. I don't think that I'm exaggerating when I say that if I were old, I think I would be taking that position. I would say my health is my responsibility and I'm going to have to wall myself off from society for a while. But I want you guys to get back out there, all of you young, healthy people. So that's part of what's motivating me. It's less the political response and more just the response of individuals in the United States in the political reality that we inhabit today, which is one in which liberties are not going to be curtailed to the extent that they were in Australia, New Zealand, obviously China. Any final comments on this?
I told my wife back at the first lockdown that here in Israel that I would have liked to have a firearm just in case. And so I'm pretty bummed out that in Israel it's very hard to obtain civilian firearms. But on the other sense, I'm very happy that it's hard for it because I know my neighbor doesn't have one. But if I was in the US, game theory-wise, my dominant strategy would be to get a firearm, even though I will not use it just because I know there are so many out there and my neighbor might have one. And if his toilet paper runs out and he's going to rob me blind, I can defend myself.
A deeper political reason for wanting firearms is to be able to turn them on a tyrannical government. That's more important to most gun rights advocates in the United States than protecting one's family, at least the really philosophically minded ones.
Yeah, I agree. But one of the reasons I'm a conservative at heart, as a leaning and not just a political, I vote for the Conservative Party or whatever, is that I do think that the current regime, at least in much of the West, could be more liberty oriented, but it's very good. And, it's like the best of all existing worlds, Edmund Burke style. So I'm very afraid of toppling governments. I agree that if the Nazis were in power, yes, I would have liked the civilian population to have firearms to protect itself. But then you need to sort of balance it out with, larger homicide rates compared to most countries. And when is the tipping point? There were a lot of left-wing people that when Trump became president, they said, oh, wait, I'm going to get a gun. And I don't think Trump was he was a grown baby, but I don't think he was a dictator and a authoritarian government that needs to be toppled with firearms.
I do not necessarily think that utilitarianism is the only approach to assessing the moral quality of different choices. And obviously, utilitarianism doesn't have a completely precise definition because what you define as utility can vary a lot. But setting aside all of those considerations from a kind of clinically utilitarian point of view, I think it is true, and this is hard to say without provoking horrified reactions. If we define utility just conventionally as something like human well-being, human preference satisfaction, to be extremely wanky about it, more utility is lost when a 30-year-old dies than when an 82-year-old dies. In other words, from a utilitarian point of view, the loss of an 82-year-old has less moral importance than the loss of a 30-year-old. And since those who have died from COVID are disproportionately older and have a much lower life expectancy than average members of the population, some might argue it's a little misleading to point to excess death and say this is the cost of COVID, because not every death has an equal cost.
Yeah. So it's true that most of the people who are dying of COVID and excess mortality is concentrated among older people. That's very true. I think, according to, very preliminary evidence, but that's all we have, that in places like India, you would get that actually the years of life lost is actually much, much higher than the raw number of excess deaths, because we have seen in particularly, poorer countries that also there is quite significant excess mortalities among, 40, 50, 55-year-old people. But it's true that if a certain disease, for example, was killing babies en masse, it would probably have a more resonance with all of us than something that was afflicting elderly homes. One of the interesting things that I'm also working on right now is if you look, for example, on deaths by age and sex in Armenia and Azerbaijan, you can see the large uptick among males of fighting age because of the Nagorno-Karabakh war, which, if you would do like a year of life analysis, then yes, the Nagorno-Karabakh war might have been more catastrophic than, COVID in these countries.
I'm reminded, one of the most poignant quotes I've ever heard was by someone whose name I can't remember, regarding World War I, but he said, surely a human life is not such a great thing to lose, but you don't think that when you're 20, and they were all 20. Okay, great. So let's turn to a brief discussion of your interactions with Bret Weinstein's assistant and what you concluded from that experience, because that played a role in our coming together, because I think it was because of that sort of experience. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a certain disillusionment with Bret Weinstein that probably led you via some route to the video that I did with Tim Nguyen, which is also kind of a story of disillusionment with Eric Weinstein. Why don't you say a little bit about, again, what you experienced with his assistant and what you concluded from the experience? And yeah.
Okay. I will preface this by saying that out of the two, I always liked Bret more. I think Eric, when you nail it down, he talks poetically and sophisticatedly, but I found very little substance in what he had to say. So I've been following Bret ever since the Evergreen story broke out. I think I jived with his classical liberal leanings and his sort of heterodox opinions. I think of myself as sort of heterodox as well. I'm an economist. I went into basically demography and epidemiology because I thought that the researchers there are sort of missing something by focusing on these officially reported COVID deaths, maybe a bit unaware of, all the biases that might go into this data itself. And they've been a very welcoming research community. But I do think it's important to listen to, skeptics and have a very free exchange of ideas. So when COVID started, I kept listening to Bret Weinstein's podcast. I didn't agree with everything he had to say, but I did think he raised, interesting reservations regarding civil liberties, regarding maybe the process of authorizing vaccines. Though, like I said, I think the proper classical liberal response to that would be let the FDA authorize anything that is not almost deadly, and then let people decide what they do and not just say, oh, it's not properly approved by all the relevant authorities in a 5-year process. So as I said, I was listening to Bret Weinstein's podcast and his wife, Heather Heying. And even before I interacted with his assistant, there were things that jived really wrongly. It started to seem as if Bret was spreading bad information much more readily than good information. He now has, I think, this famous tweet that shows, 20% of people have reported headaches after the vaccine. So that means people are not testing the vaccine correctly, and it might cause, like brain tumors or something. It was complete nonsense. Back in February 2021, after we uploaded the first version of the paper to a preprint server, and again, Bret has talked about this issue of yes, excess deaths, no excess deaths, etc. So I sent it to, the email address of the podcast and saying that I think this is very interesting. And, if you'd like to talk or someone else would like to talk, I can describe more what we find. Here's the abstract and here's the URL. And I got a response almost immediately from his assistant that said, before I pass this along, I wanted to ask you, are you seeing the harmful effects of lockdowns on deferred medical activities, suicides, overdoses, etc.? Which I think is a fair question. Again, that's sort of one of the reasons that I went into this entire line of research. I think an even more interesting answer is what I have, which is we have no evidence for that, because I would have thought suicides would have spiked up, to a large degree. And the evidence from Australia and New Zealand shows the complete opposite. There's no excess deaths if there's no COVID. So I gave a pretty detailed response in that regard. And then I got no response back. And then I think I tried again a few weeks or months later, and then no response back. And then I kept listening to his podcast after this. And, he said something along the lines of the issue with the mainstream COVID science community is that they block any dissenting opinion or research that doesn't suit their priors. Unlike me, who's extremely open, and now I'm judging each claim by its merit, which, is the high philosophical goal of an actual scientist. And I found that laughable, because he kept saying these things about, how suicides are probably up, how lockdowns probably kill more than COVID. And these are completely baseless. It's a fair hypothesis to have, but then you should test it against data. And what I presented, I think, is a very good way to test this data. But the moment I said that I do not find support for this claim, I was blocked, essentially. Not the sense that he blocked me on Twitter or something, but the sense that he did not want me to come forward. And I think that if my research would have shown, yes, lockdowns kill, COVID vaccines kill, all of these things that he has been claiming, I think he would have embraced it with open arms, as he has embraced really shoddy research and claims on ivermectin and the dangers of COVID vaccines, etc. Like you said in your conversation with Tim, even alternative, each community has like a silo. So the alternative community might claim, oh, the mainstream community does not accept our alternative evidence, which might be very important, but the alternative community might be even more siloed than the mainstream community because they put their entire reputation at stake on claims such as Heather Haynes says, some people will never be able to admit things such as vaccines being unsafe. And I think since then I stopped listening.
A lot of people, including myself, on complex matters really genuinely desire to know the truth. And it's hard to know what the truth is. You can't empirically investigate every positive claim, right? You have to outsource your analysis to other people. And so a very important question becomes, who do you trust to follow the evidence, even if the evidence collides with your ideological bent or maybe with the narrative that's getting you a lot of views, whatever it may be? Who do you trust to follow the evidence? No matter how it might hurt you socially, professionally, or ideologically, if I can put it that way. And it sounds like in this case, Bret Weinstein's failure to follow the evidence where it leads, it's not because it collides with his ideology, except insofar as he may have a certain ideological predisposition toward believing that the mainstream community is suppressing some view. But certainly he has some kind of investment. I don't know what exactly it is because I don't know what's in his mind, but he has some kind of investment in the set of views that he is putting forward about vaccines, about alternatives to vaccines, about Western government's response to the pandemic. And when those views collide with evidence, he's siding with his views, not with the evidence. Maybe that was a roundabout way to put it, but a few things about this that I want to say based on my own experiences. First of all, I just wanted to note that if you're invested in a certain set of views, you can find people with Ph.D.s and fancy titles who will make the same argument, right? You can always find 10 people who seem credible who will make the same argument. And in this connection, you criticize Bret Weinstein for relying heavily on the work of the Stanford professor of
I think chemistry, Michael Levitt.
Right. So Michael Levitt, a Stanford professor of chemistry. So Michael Levitt has reached excess mortality estimates that are much lower than the ones you've reached, but he's reached them on the basis of, according to you, bad data and models. So for example, with respect to Brazil, he relied on data from the civil registry where they were building up their capacity from 2015 to 2020. So they were underreporting more excessively in 2015 than in 2016, more excessively in 2016 than in 2017, such that the prediction for 2020 when the pandemic hit was very high. And the actual mortality rates in 2020 relative to that high estimate were pretty low, suggesting that not that many people have died due to the pandemic, right? You also made the point that he's not modeling this as precisely as he could be. Like, it's accurate to say that the pandemic started in 2020, but it's more precise to say that it started in March of 2020, right? So January and February 2020 are not part of the COVID pandemic, and a really careful excess mortality estimate would break things down monthly, not annually, right? And so Michael Levitt was making some of these basic errors, but because he reached a conclusion that was consistent with the views that Bret Weinstein seems to be invested in, he's citing this person's work very favorably. And as you say, just not engaging with your work. You know, his assistant is asking if it reaches
what he wants me
conclusions. To reach. Yeah, right. Like,
the thing about Brazil, it sounds like, this really like technical issue. It's not very difficult. What I'm doing is very not difficult. When I saw like some data point for like total deaths and thus excess mortality in some country, I don't even remember which, and it was massively high, thousands of percentages higher than expected. If I was very invested in I want to show you that access is a real problem, I would have, tweeted it right away. But, I have what we call sanity checks. If the data doesn't show what you expected to find early on, it's more probably that it's an issue with data than a smell test. Exactly. It has to pass the sniff test. So I went out and, I collected more data and collected the colleagues' opinions on this. When Levitt says that, 2015 deaths in Brazil are 40% lower than 2019, and nothing happened between 2015 and 2019 that would explain such a huge increase. And again, year to year, deaths increase by usually even just fractions of percentage points. That's why predicting expected deaths is pretty easy to do. And in countries without COVID, 2020 deaths and 2021 deaths track expected to the letter. The fact that he let it continue, seeing this, and then predicting for 2020, and then saying, it's just like a 7% increase, which again, by itself is also big because it usually varies by much lower than that. That means, he was more ready to accept unusual findings if they support his case than should be. But, like you said, you can find hundreds of PhDs to support each claim. I dislike the current mainstream opinion of credentialism. Who are you to argue with Anthony Fauci or this doctor or this researcher or that when you are just X? And I say, who am I to argue with the Nobel laureate? I am someone to argue with him because he doesn't know what he's talking about. And let the claims be measured by the claims and not by the person claiming them.
Logic and evidence are logic and evidence. I hate credentialism too, and there's a lot of it. I've been to pretty prestigious institutions, and I don't take very seriously the fact that someone has degrees from them. I don't. And it's in part just based on my own experience. A lot of the most brilliant people I know operate completely outside prestigious academic institutions. Some of them barely went to college or maybe didn't even go to college. And then I've met a lot of really dumb or just extremely ideological people in very prestigious institutions. So I'm a big opponent of credentialism too, and would love to see our economy move toward a more truly meritocratic and maybe even more certification-based system for assessing how capable people are of discharging certain kinds of duties. But that said, I do believe in expertise, and there's a big difference between those two things. Some people are expert. They may not have credentials, but you're clearly an expert in this area of
Unfortunately, yes.
excess mortality, right? And I don't know exactly what your academic background is, but just talking to you, it's clear, right? The other thing I was going to say is that, you cannot rely on individuals to reason well, to reason without confirmation bias, to not let their emotions and relationships and incentives distort their analyses. You cannot, no individual does it perfectly, honestly, but you can't rely on individuals even to do it particularly well. Some do it much better than others, right? What you need, and this is the difficult part, you need to create processes and institutions that lead to the production of good information, despite the shortcomings and defects of the individuals carrying out the research. And that's a whole other conversation about how to do that. I do think transparency, a kind of adversarial system where everyone has an incentive to falsify another person's findings, those things are good. In preparation for this conversation, I went back over some of my old notes about Bret Weinstein because I have not followed him for a while and stopped following him like you did because I stopped trusting him to sense make, to use Rebel Wisdom's preferred term effectively. But given that you had this experience with him, I wanted to recover some of my old thoughts, my old conclusions. And so I wrote them down in summary form, and I just thought I would share them. So I don't remember a lot of the details of the road that led me to these conclusions, but just for what it's worth, I probably spent 10 hours consuming Bret Weinstein's content related to ivermectin. I was very interested in that issue because Bret Weinstein is an extremely gifted communicator. He's hyper articulate, speaks with a lot of confidence, kind of easy to be convinced by him if you're not getting alternative points of view, right? And so I was interested in his ivermectin claims. Before the ivermectin issue, I generally viewed him as a relatively reliable source, which is not to say that I agreed with him about everything, but I guess I didn't question his sense-making practices that much. And so all of that said, I really wanted to know the truth about ivermectin. That was the thing. I was like, wow, Bret Weinstein, this guy I kind of generally respect, is making some pretty strong claims about the efficacy of this drug. And wow, if what he's saying is really true, it's like the solution is at hand, everyone, So I wanted to know the truth. And so obviously, if you want to know the truth about something, you hear his arguments and then you hear the best counter arguments and you try to make your determination. And so it's out of that process that I reached the following conclusion. So maybe at the top level, I would say that one conclusion I reached is just that Bret and Heather made a lot of unsupported statements about the efficacy of ivermectin, and pretty hard to believe statements that ivermectin was being suppressed, at least in large part because there was nothing to gain financially from the dissemination of that drug, as distinct from the dissemination of vaccines. Now, in response to Bret's statements about the efficacy of ivermectin and the reasons for its suppression, several figures, most notably perhaps Eric Topol on the Sam Harris podcast, Yuri Dagan, who may have been the person to introduce the lab leak hypothesis, David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom, several figures, including these, offered in-depth critiques of Bret's statements, or they attempted to characterize the current state of evidence with respect to ivermectin. Now, importantly, the question was not whether ivermectin works. The question was whether there was sufficient evidence to believe that it worked and to tell the public that it was a viable alternative to vaccines, at least under some circumstances. And in his statements, or at least implicitly, Bret Weinstein said the answer was yes to those questions, and his critics disagreed. So Yuri Dagan spent 2 hours laying out his critiques of Bret's statements about ivermectin and some of his other statements on Rebel Wisdom. Rebel Wisdom and David Fuller produced several videos that were about ivermectin that were somewhat critical of Bret. And David Fuller also put out, I thought, a comparatively high quality essay on Medium, summarizing the state of evidence with respect to ivermectin. Eric Topol, I can't remember his exact post, but he's another expert in relevant areas. He appeared on Sam Harris's podcast, and he weighed the existing evidence for ivermectin against the evidentiary standards for assessing the effectiveness of interventions. And he said ivermectin might be effective, but we don't know yet. And we have much better evidence for the vaccine's long-term net effectiveness than we do for ivermectin. Now, it's been a long time since I consumed these materials, but I came away thinking that Yuri Dagan, David Fuller, Eric Topol seemed much more convincing, balanced, less driven by confirmation bias than Bret and Heather. And Bret and Heather put out an essay on their Substack summarizing their views about ivermectin, and it was so shoddy compared to the quality of critiques coming from people like Yuri Dagan and even the quality of David Fuller's essay on Medium. Like very shoddy, laughably shoddy. And I think they said on one of their podcasts, like, this is our final statement on the matter. And also, Bret did not have in-depth discussions with the aforementioned individuals. He did not engage with their work substantively, as far as I can tell, although he did get into some Twitter conflicts with Claire Lehman and with David Fuller, a friend of his. He ironically called Yuri Dagan extremely reckless. That was just comical, to call Yuri Dagan extremely reckless, which he did on his Dark Horse podcast. So my kind of summary conclusion based on what I've just described is that Bret, like his brother in the case of Tim Nguyen, seems to have trouble steel manning his critics and dealing with the substance of their arguments. He lets his emotions get in the way, or maybe incentives get in the way. I don't know. And it's ironic because I think Bret Weinstein is the person who brought the term steel manning into widespread public use. The first time I heard the term steel manning was, I think it was when Bret moderated the dialogues on religion between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. Or maybe it was before that. But in any case, when I think of the term steel manning, I think of Bret Weinstein saying it and very eloquently articulating why it's important. He and Eric, they tout that approach to sense making, but fail pretty basically to adhere to it in their own attempts to sense make. So that's what I wanted to say.
I agree. I would also mention Gideon Meyeritz-Katz and Kyle Sheldrick.
The health nerd.
The health
nerd, right.
They are experts in the field, even though I think Gideon is, oh my God, not even a PhD. They have done very good work at parsing out the research evidence for ivermectin.
I should have mentioned a health nerd. I mean, he just tore apart the main studies on which, Bret's claims about ivermectin were based. I mean, it was clear that Bret had not seriously looked at any of these studies. And they were the linchpin of the meta-analyses that Bret was referring to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a great point.
I think the ivermectin issue came about from pretty obvious issues, like the entire hydroxychloroquine issue.
Hydroxychloroquine, yeah.
Yes, where really shoddy research, which I, as a statistician, saw almost immediately and without prompt, but maybe doctors did not, said that, they collected all these amazing data, and not only is it not effective against COVID, it's harmful. And that caused some, randomized control trials to test its efficacy and effectiveness to halt, because, if it's dangerous to people, it's ethically, compromised to continue. And the research was fake. It was published in The Lancet, which is, one of the top medical journals in the world. And it was so obviously fake. It was probably someone took, SPSS or Stata or R or Excel and just randomized values for things and then maybe changed them a bit to have the treatment group fare worse than the control group. It was really obvious statistically that things were too homogeneous. There was no heterogeneity across continents, across countries, and the amount of data that they supposedly had was immaculate patient level, individual level data from hospitals from the developing and developed world. It was bad research. And when this research was exposed as a forgery, what happened was, which is understandable, a lot of people who supported it as a treatment said, it's probably okay because the research that showed that it was so bad and so many people touted, The Guardian said, science shows HCO is not what you think it is, et cetera, then of course they're going to do the same for other treatments as well. Now, if a research is shown to be a forgery, it means that the claims in the research are unreliable, but it doesn't mean that the opposite of these claims is true, right? So I can do a pretty shoddy research showing how my friend murdered someone. It still might be that he murdered someone, even if the research I did is completely shoddy. And hydroxychloroquine or whatever you call it is probably ineffective. But the research was a forgery. And then all these ivermectin studies come out, which again, the health nerd and other people have, I think, parsed out really nicely how bad they are, and some of them actual forgeries as well, that it's pretty amazingly sad that someone like Bret and Heather, I do think they're terribly smart people. I don't really think they read it. I think they read the abstract, and I think they have, friends who are doctors who said, something along the lines that, yeah, I treat my patients with ivermectin and not a single one of them died, which might be true, but it's an anecdote. It's the start of research. It's not the end of the claim. And then when you read the abstract, there's no details in the abstract. The abstract just says, we saw that in India, they took ivermectin and there's very little reported COVID death in India, so everything is okay. And then when you look into the research, you see that they don't know if people took ivermectin or not. They just said, okay, in Kenya, people take ivermectin, but in Egypt, they don't. And Kenya reports no COVID deaths, so it's bound to work. They don't know if people are taking ivermectin, and they don't know what we now do know, that, places differ in their ability to report even all deaths, let alone COVID deaths. So Egypt and South Africa are one of the few countries in Africa that actually have viral registration. So let alone, COVID-19 certification. I think the main issue with Bret and why I never listened to him for biology stuff. It's not very interesting to me. I mostly thought about it, in the classical liberal sense. It was interesting to me about free speech, etc. I think that when something like this happened, it's what I call the shopping channel syndrome. In the shopping channel, they will have like a jewelry piece or a sofa or some other item that I have zero knowledge about. And it would look like a really good item, and the discount was very good. And I'd be impressed by, the presenter saying, oh, it has this sort of foam and texture and textile. It's immaculate and it's heavily discounted. That's great. And then they would advertise a computer. And I was a computer nerd. And they would talk. It was nonsense. It was overpriced nonsense. They would say have, triple speed, meaning 333 hertz when the standard was 400. And they would say the retail price is, 5,000. We're selling it for 4,000. The retail price of something like that would have been 1,000. It was complete nonsense. And then I understood that, probably the implication is that the other products, which I know nothing about, are also shit. So when Bret has shown such bad sense-making abilities on this regard, I do not trust him to offer me an honest review of evidence on other issues.
That's actually a complicated issue. I mean, I was immediately reminded of my experience with Noam Chomsky, because I love listening to Chomsky on linguistics. I haven't read his stuff on linguistics, but I've listened to him talk about linguistics and I really enjoy it. Also, when I was in college, I listened to a fair amount of his political commentary, and he's mainly talking about historical events in parts of the world that I know virtually nothing about. But then he'll talk about Latin America. That's that's when I realized he's just cherry picking evidence and providing such a tendentious monomaniacal narrative about Latin America and the effect of US relations with Latin America on Latin American development that it discredited all of his political analysis, in my view. Not necessarily his linguistic analysis. I wouldn't go that far. I was also going to say that it's so ironic. Eric Weinstein said we have to dine a la carte with people. Like, some people have very valuable insights to offer, but a lot of what they say is ridiculous. And everyone's some combination, right? And, just because someone is wrong about something doesn't mean they're wrong about everything. Now, that's not what you're saying, but I think that going forward, I'm probably not going to stop listening ever to Eric and Bret Weinstein. I mean, they have illuminated a lot of things for me. They've turned me on to topics that I have then pursued. They've articulated thoughts that were unarticulated, but kind of brewing in me very well. So there are lots of things about the Weinsteins that I value. And I still plan to some extent to dine a la carte with them, but it is true that I don't follow either of them. Like, I don't follow Bret anymore. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, yeah. I mean, with respect to Bret and Heather and Eric, and actually Dave Rubin, who's very similar, much less bright. But one thing they all have in common is, I mean, I noticed this in particular with Heather. She throws out the term bad faith far too often. To make a bad faith criticism means that you have some unstated motive for criticizing the person, and you're just making whatever argument you can in order to criticize them, but your real reason for criticizing them is unstated and hidden.
Following your video with Tim, I started following Tim on Twitter. And he published something on mostly, I think, Eric's wife, but Eric's, application of gauge theory to measuring inflation, which I, as an economist, found interesting as an idea, but then found it to be completely lacking in any substance.
Not deserving of a Nobel Prize?
No.
I'm sorry.
And now that I understand a lot of it, it is pretty hard mathematical stuff, but you don't solve a hard economic question by throwing a lot of math at it. And some of the responses that Tim has are quite amazing. People who would have championed Eric and others because, they are purveyors of truth wherever it is, and whomever, doesn't matter, are saying to him, look, what else are you doing except attacking Eric? How dare you attack Eric? Who are you to even question what he puts out? And does it matter? Let's say he has a personal vendetta against Eric. Yeah. Okay, let's adjudicate the claims accordingly. But no, now if someone's claim to fame sort of is, I looked into his arguments deeply and I find them lacking, that doesn't mean he did it in bad faith. And even if he did, you still need to counter the arguments.
Even if he did, the argument is either true or it isn't. As I said to Tim, if Hitler or Stalin quantized gravity, we wouldn't throw out their quantization of gravity. Yeah.
And one of the things that also bugged me on the COVID, let's say, again, like mainstream community, is I think there are people in the COVID denying community and ivermectin supporting who are probably grifters, that they profit from it. But the vast majority is good faith argument in the sense that they believe these things to be true. And even if it was bad faith argument, you still need to counter them. You should suppose that the arguments are in good faith, because otherwise there's no argument, right?
The point I was making is simply that in my observation, my impression is that Heather sees bad faith where there isn't much evidence for it. Like, I think she said Yuri Dagan was bad faith. And I don't know, Yuri Dagan really seems like a straight shooter to me. He just says what he thinks. And, Dave Rubin, I think in his interactions with Claire Lehman, either explicitly or implicitly impugned her motives. And Eric Weinstein with Tim Nguyen, I mean, just like being pretty vicious toward him.
It's a way to avoid the argument. It's not an argument. It's a way to avoid the argument.
It could be a cynical way to avoid an argument, or it could be just something is activated emotionally for certain people when they receive criticism and they really think that must be what's causing it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the psychology. Yeah.
I don't think Heather is acting in bad faith when she's declaring bad faith arguments against them. I think she's acting in good faith, because that's what I generally believe. I think she truly believes that anyone that thinks that, vaccines are safe and effective and ivermectin is unfortunately not the wonder drug that we want, I think she does think that they're acting in bad faith because to her, the evidence is so clear. But again, that's why you need to counter and confront the claims and the evidence. This is sort of almost the entire shtick of a lot of these crowds. They would have said, the moment you don't think my arguments make sense, you accuse me of being a fascist, a Nazi, a neoliberal, a white supremacist, and all of these things. But if you would listen to what I have to say, you would understand there's much common ground. And now when people are countering their arguments, they could have said, that's an interesting argument, I don't agree with it. But no, you're acting in bad faith. You're a pharma shill. Come on.
Yeah. Ad hominem. It's just one of innumerable examples of ad hominem. And one thing I tell my students, I always emphasize to them is just engage the substance of arguments. The question is always, is the claim true or not? It might be an interesting question. What's motivating this actor to make this utterance? But it's a completely separate issue. It's like arguments are good or bad, regardless of who makes them, regardless of what's motivating them to make them. And insofar as we're pursuing a question, we just need to line up the propositions and assess them on the basis of logic and evidence. That's it. And therefore, the assumption of good faith makes sense, even if it's not always true.
I also have this, censorious urge to tell them, who are you to question me? I'm an expert on this. I try to avoid it as best I can. But like you said, an adversarial system, in a sense, we could have, the goal of being as objective as possible and truth-seeking wherever it is. But people are usually not like that. But the fact that there are partisan people engaging a similar topic and you can pick from both of them or they engage with each other, I think is actually the way, science moves forward and not people changing their mind because they're pursuers of truth. Because probably me as well, again, I have this censorious urge. And if I had the following that people like Eric and Bret have, I would probably be even more emboldened in my position that I am the expert on all things X.
Right. Epistemic closure becomes a much harder phenomenon to counter as you get more famous and powerful. Yeah. And it's great that you're introspecting in this way and not just demonizing the Weinsteins, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Just on the subject of introspection, I know that in argument, when I appeal to authority, it's because I've run out of good points to make. And I shouldn't do that. If I run out of good arguments, good evidence, or a good kind of logical argument, then I might say also one other thing that's influencing me is that I regard this as a trusted source and they agree with me, right? But to say, they say this is true, and therefore it's true. But when I'm in an adversarial conversation, I probably do feel an instinct to do that sometimes. And anyway, Ariel, this has been great.
It's been really fun.
Hopefully this is not our last conversation. It was really great meeting you. And
you too.
We'll talk more.
Okay. Bye. See ya.
All right. Take care. Bye.